I'm sure that you have heard the old African American spiritual that asks the question, were you there when they crucified my Lord? We'll maybe even sing that sometime during Holy Week. I believe that Adam Hamilton's series, 24 Hours, that changed the world, helps us to re-experience those last 24 hours of Jesus' earthly life in a way that we can answer, yes, we were there. We are on a journey this Lent to help bring some life to our imaginations so we can walk through those hours with Jesus and somehow more fully realize His living presence in us now. We're not just trying to gain head knowledge, even though maybe some of you have learned a thing or two over the last few weeks, but rather this journey is about opening our spirits and our emotions to God and being more open to the events of that day that formed us today as disciples of Jesus. Well, if we are going to be successful in thinking about that day and walking along with Jesus through the events of that day, when it comes to surrounding the events surrounding His arrest, we really need to ask ourselves, where do we imagine ourselves standing at that time? You know, we had to be someplace. What group would we fit in with? If we had to hang out with some group of people, what group would we hang out with as we observe the events of that day? First, do we find ourselves being like a part of that crowd that followed Judas to come and arrest Jesus? Now, we might give them a pretty bad rap, but when you think about those people, they were really very afraid. They were afraid that they would lose everything if this maverick rabbi ended up heading a revolt against Rome. You know, the Romans didn't deal well with rebellion. They would just come in and kill everybody standing and sort of clear the ground and then try to put together some people that would lead whoever was left alive. Those who followed Judas to the Garden of Gethsemane wanted to avoid that. They wanted to get rid of Jesus quietly. That was why they came for Him late at night. And if they had acted openly to try to arrest Him, the crowd might have rioted, and the results would have been the same as if there was a rebellion. The Romans might have come in, killed everybody around to bring order, and might have ended up even destroying the city and the temple, and maybe even all of its inhabitants. It really was a politically dangerous situation. And so that crowd coming to arrest Jesus probably felt like they were between a rock and a hard place. They clearly didn't think it was possible that Jesus really was God's Messiah. And every single scenario that they could think of that had Him still alive after the Passover was over was one that they thought was just unacceptable. They believed Jesus had to be discredited and killed in order to keep the peace, to keep order in their country. So have you ever seen your relationship with Jesus as something that caused trouble? something that had to be put behind you to keep the peace in your life or your work or your family? If so, maybe you can understand this group. Maybe you're one of those folks. Or if not, I think a lot of us probably would say, well, no, we're more like the disciples with Jesus. And yet we have to remember that if we are, all of those disciples turned and ran when the soldiers showed up in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, again, in their defense, it's got to be scary when a group of soldiers come for you. These were big, strong guys, and they had weapons, and they were willing to use them. They all said that they'd never desert Jesus when things were safe, and they were warm and well-fed. But the guards had come, and after all, Peter had just sliced off that guy's ear. You know, think about what it's like when somebody attacks a law enforcement officer. I mean, they were in danger of being arrested and beaten up and imprisoned themselves, maybe even killed. And so they didn't want that to happen. Look at this painting by Pavel Popov. I don't know, it's awfully dark, it's hard to see in here, but it's the betrayal of Jesus, and on the right side you can see that disciple that is described in Mark's Gospel as the young man that was dressed in a linen sheet. And they grabbed the sheet and he went running off naked into the dark just to be able to get away. Everything seemed to be falling apart for Jesus' disciples at that point. And in their panic, all they could think of was getting away. So have you ever found yourself afraid to stand up to injustice with Jesus? Because if you did stand up, the people in power might hurt you or someone that you cared about. Have you ever kept hidden by keeping your mouth shut and just sort of fading into the background when things got dangerous? If so, you can understand the disciples who ran and hid. Maybe you're a part of that group. Maybe some of you identify with the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, or with one of the priests. Most of them just wanted Jesus to shut up. But you know that some of them admired his passion for truth and justice, his love for the poor, even if they did it secretly. Some of them probably thought he was just mentally unbalanced and didn't want to see him killed for that. They might have thought he was overly zealous, but didn't see that as something worthy of death. Some of them even seemed to have recognized him as a prophet and wanted him to be able to live and share his knowledge and wisdom with others, like Nicodemus. You remember Nicodemus came to him at night and said, "We know you're from God. Nobody could do this stuff if God wasn't with him." Nicodemus was part of that group. At any rate, the Sanhedrin, those leaders of Israel, were probably pretty impressed with themselves, if we really want to be honest with it. They understood the scriptures and said, "Oh, after all, God speaks through us, not some country bumpkin rabbi from Galilee." But when Jesus used the name of God, when he said he was the Messiah, when he said he would come at the Father's right hand on the clouds of heaven, well, They didn't believe that was possible at all. They discounted the possibility that he really was the true Messiah of God. And when he made those claims, they all agreed that he was committing heresy and was worthy of death. Have you ever thought that Jesus was certainly a good man, but you couldn't go along with the claims that he's the promised Messiah, that he's God in the flesh? Have you ever thought he's a good man to be admired, but certainly not a master to be obeyed? If so, you probably fit in with the priests and the Sanhedrin better than you think. Or would you see yourself like Peter? When the soldiers arrived, you remember, he started to fight for Jesus, but Jesus told him to put away his sword, and so he stopped, and he also sort of faded away, but because he promised he wouldn't desert Jesus, he followed at a distance. He followed him right up to the high priest's house, and as they put Jesus in the dungeon and waited for the Sanhedrin to assemble, he hung around. He even managed to get into the courtyard of the house. He was brave, but when he heard the witnesses lying about Jesus, when he heard people talking and he saw that popular opinion was turning against Jesus, he got scared. He knew that things had gone bad, and he lost his courage. Now, when it was safe back in the upper room, he said he would die or go to prison with Jesus. That wouldn't be a problem. But all it took was a couple of serving girls recognizing him, the crowd understanding from his accent that he was from Galilee, and all of his courage crumbled. He not only denied knowing Jesus 3 times, he called curses down on himself if he was lying. When the rooster crowed, he knew that Jesus knew him completely, and that Jesus had known what he was going to do. And he went out and he cried about the person that he was. Would you have been like Peter, trying to stand for Jesus, but caving in when you knew that people were against you and against him? Have you ever wanted to be faithful, but found that through your actions you had even denied that you were a follower of Christ? Have you ever been disappointed in yourself for not being the kind of Christian that you should be? I know I have. If so, maybe we fit right in there beside Peter. Well, there was another group in Jerusalem that day. The serving girls were a couple of them, and some of those people were home in their beds, asleep. They were the people who really weren't paying attention to what was going on that day. They were only concerned with their lives, their families, and not all of the God stuff going on around them. They were content to let other people make decisions for them, and the next day they'd click their tongues about yet another young man being crucified by the Romans, but wouldn't really care or know whether it had anything to do with them. They were just too busy with their own lives to let it bother them. Have you ever been too busy to care about the things of God? Have you ever been too wrapped up in your own life or your family to care about injustice and suffering? Have you ever chosen to ignore the questions, who is this guy Jesus? And what does all of this have to do with me? If so, you probably fit in with this last group of people, but don't stay with them. There's too much happening and too much at stake to ignore Jesus and what he did for you in those last 24 hours. Well, I hope that you have considered some of those questions about where you are in the story of Jesus. Now, there's a slip of paper in your bulletins with the upcoming services on one side, and some of those slides with the questions on them, and I hope you can read those. And I would encourage you to, during this coming week, every day read the 14th chapter of Mark's Gospel and pray about these questions. See if you fit in with any of those groups. My prayer is that you might see yourself there in Jerusalem, but instead of maybe being part of one of those groups, that you might find yourself coming to stand beside Jesus at that time. Yet we all have some similarity in one way or another with all of those groups. But use that to draw close to Jesus, the one around whom all of those events of the last 24 hours swirl. May you find his peace in your heart as you draw close to him. Amen and amen.